Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are joining us from. My name is Sarah Kawamura. I am the Health, Equity, and Resilience Coordinator of the World Green Building Council. I will be your host for today, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our Social Impact webinar. Let me begin by giving an overview of the World Green Building Council and our network. It is the largest local, regional, global action network leading the transformation to sustainable and decarbonized built environments for everyone, everywhere. We work with businesses, organizations, and governments to deliver on the ambitions of the Paris Agreement and UN global goals for sustainable development. We do this by driving systemic change to address whole life carbon emissions of existing and new buildings, secure regenerative, resource-efficient, and waste-free built environments, and enable resilient, healthy, equitable, and inclusive places. Through the Health, Equity, and Resilience Global Program, the World GBC produced several publications over the years to guide the industry to a built environment that delivers healthy, equitable, and resilient buildings to communities and cities. Today, we'll be reflecting on the importance of considering the social sustainability issues in the built environment, which we recently released in a position paper called Social Impact Across the Built Environment, which you'll hear more about shortly. But before we dive into the details of the social impact paper, please allow me to introduce you to our opening remarks speaker, Alida Saleh. Alida serves as the Senior Advisor for the Climate Champions Built Environment Team, led by the high-level champions for COP28, Her Excellency Razan Al Mubarak. Alida is a global sustainability leader, bringing over 20 years of expertise, developing sustainable and net zero transition strategies on an international scale. She is a highly regarded domain expert within the field, leveraging her knowledge, network, and expertise to translate complex sustainability challenges into practical action plans to achieve results. It is a great pleasure to have you with us today, Alida. The floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's absolutely a pleasure to be here. Hello, everyone. This is a great opportunity for us to talk about a topic that is so important, so critical, and so urgent. Yet I feel that it's often misunderstood. This is the climate crisis that each and every one of us is going to be impacted by. And we have to understand that climate change is going to impact you and me in many different ways. Hence, for me, it's not an environmental problem. It's a people issue. It's an intricate and multifaceted human issue. For the climate champions, our mission is to help accelerate the race to a better world, a zero carbon and resilient world, a healthier, safer, and fairer world. The built environment is all about people. It's where we experience the world. Hence, the way we design, construct, manage our built environment has significant ripple effects on both our environmental as well as our social experiences. So what exactly is included in the built environment? It consists of our buildings, infrastructures, and cities. It's one of the major contributors to climate change, responsible for almost 40% of global carbon emissions. However, its impacts go far beyond the environment. The climate crisis is, by the very nature, a social crisis. Everything we do in this sector, every decision we make, has repercussions that extends far beyond the brick and mortar that we lay. They impact human values, rights, and lives. In essence, they shape our shared tomorrow. So let's prioritize shaping it well. One critical aspect that we must focus on is the social dimension of sustainability, the S within the ESG. It's time our sector pays attention to this as we navigate towards more inclusive, equitable, and sustainable built environments. Issues such as diversity, health and safety, privacy and securities, and the various ways in which we interact with our climate all need to be part of our discussions. As we work towards building a more sustainable future, we must tread carefully, always aware of the potential for inadvertent inequalities. Our overall objective must be to transition that's inclusive and sustainable at the same time. Our responsibility is to ensure that no one is left behind as we cross our paths to a greener future, a more sustainable future. What we need today is a call to our global sector, a call to define, measure, and take action on the social impacts of our infrastructure, a call to support a globally equitable, decarbonized built environment. The World Green Building Council's social impact paper is a stepping stone towards that goal, and I wanted to congratulate you on publishing this. It provides an in-depth examination of the 4 critical scopes of social impact issues, ranging from equity and internal practices, building users and sites, community surroundings, and supply and value chain, all which are critical to ensuring that our humans are prioritized across the built environment. The report is full of case studies and guidance for addressing these issues. To give you a sense of the magnitude of this challenge, consider this. Climate change affects 85% of the world's population. Nearly 40% of the world's population is projected to suffer from inadequate housing by 2030. And devastatingly large number of people worldwide fall prey to forced labor, with industry often being at high-risk sector. These are not just numbers. It's about human lives. It's about human futures. Today, I request each one of you to play a pivotal role in mitigating this climate crisis and its associated social impacts. That's not just a responsibility, it's a profound opportunity for us to redefine the role and the legacy of the built environment sector. Let's make this count. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alida, and thank you very much for the High Level Climate Champions team as well for always supporting our work on health equity and resilience. We really appreciate it.
Always
Thank you
a pleasure
for joining us. And for the audience, just to note, please feel free to use the Q&A box for any questions you may have, and we will try and answer them right after the panel discussion. So I'd like to introduce you to our next speaker, Steve Scott. Steve is a co-founder of GHD Advisory and the EMEA Future Communities Lead. He's an urban economist with over 30 years international experience, specializing in developing built environment solutions to create places where communities are connected, resilient, productive, and inspired. His ethos is to underpin innovation with data and to take a place-based approach to better understand community needs and how this impacts the transformation of urban areas. Steve, it's a pleasure to have you with us today, and on to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the kind introduction as well. Delighted to be here to outline the social impact paper and give it an introduction in the lead into the panel discussion. The built environment marks the physical location where all climate and social stresses come together and are felt within our homes, within our communities, and within our cities. And I think sometimes that we forget when we're working on climate action, sustainability, green buildings, that everything that we work towards within our sector is really for people. That's why we create urban places. And to ensure that we have, well, I guess it's our responsibility to ensure that we have a comfortable and resilient planet where we don't only survive climate shocks, but we actually sort of thrive in spite of them. So GHD, so pleased to collaborate with the World Green Building Council on this topic last year, where one of the key realizations was that although the topic of S in ESG is growing, the use of many different terms and definitions, some people call it social impact, social value, social equity, social justice, is creating sort of confusion and misalignment in certain parts of the industry. We also recognize that the built environment industry is somewhat disengaged from the social element of sustainable development, and see the environmental and social issues faced by the sector as different or separate. But the fact of the matter is all these issues are linked, and a lack of action on one side of the ESG equation will undoubtedly affect the other, which is why the S is so important. So the social impact paper was published at COP28 back in December last year, endorsed by Her Excellency Razan Al Mubarak, to encourage the sector to engage with social impacts in the same way as they do environmental and governance aspects across industry and around the world. The paper and the work aims to increase awareness of the responsibility and accountability of the sector to reduce negative social impacts at all stages of building and construction life cycle, and consequently increase engagement, reporting and action around the S in ESG. And from my perspective, from a Future Communities point of view, the S in ESG is absolutely critical. So really delighted by the output of the paper and the outcomes that hopefully we can all take forward as a sector. So the core part of this paper, if you move to the next slide, please. The core part of the paper is about making a statement to industry, presenting a framework based on the terminology of scopes, which mirrors the well-known language that's used in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. So in the same way that global markets recognize and measure scope 1, 2, 3 carbon emissions, we're also calling for the building and construction sector to adopt an aligned framing of social impact, which is also based on 3 scopes, plus a new scope 0, which we'll go through. So taking each scope in sequence, if you like. Scope 0 is for the social impact issues and considerations for the internal governance practices and purposes of a company or organization. So the internal measure, if you like. Before going out there and talking about social impact, we need to make sure that we as organization, as employers and practitioners are applying and creating positive social impact for the people around us. So this will include things like ethical leadership, ensuring employee health, working conditions and satisfaction at work, stakeholder engagement, corporate governance, those internal sort of measures. So that's scope 0, starting point. Going one step out to scope 1, this is more about social impact issues and considerations related to users and occupiers of all building types, including residential, commercial, retail, healthcare, academic buildings, etc. So this is about, these are sort of scope and measures, really looking at things like housing attainability, indoor environmental quality, climate change impacts, adaptation measures, those sort of criteria, if you like. Going one step further out to scope 2, this is about the social impact issues and considerations on all people sharing common places and spaces with close geographical proximity. So within this scope, we're looking at impacts within neighborhoods, looking at accessibility, issues around just transition, community protection and empowerment. So going kind of one step wider from individual building type into sort of place related impacts. And then finally, scope 3 is for all organizations and processes involved in the production, distribution, and the delivery of goods and services across all stages of the built environment life cycle. So it's very much extending the impact framework out to the supply chain, the value chain. So here we're looking at criteria around environmental risks, sustainable construction, transparency and audit, labor rights, those sorts of issues. So that's the 3 scopes, 4 scopes, including scope 0, within the social impact framework that the report outlines. And I think really, if we think about call to action, the social impact paper aims to invigorate the industry's engagement with both social and environmental elements of sustainability in the built environment. To really, I guess, revolutionize decisions that are being made at all stages of the built environment process, from investment, design, through construction, operational, and then equally as importantly, the end of life phases of our built environment. We're very much calling for the sector to use these scopes through what we like to call the 5 A's, which are assessment, accountability, action, advocacy, and awareness, as shown on the diagram on the slide. The idea is to seed these core principles into your own discussion and further development, recognizing the need to adapt and tailor them to every local and organizational context. It's also important to realize that we should not only focus on creating social impact, but rather to recognize and uphold social value, equity, and justice that may already exist around us. Sometimes we're the ones who need to learn from others. So there's a real call for us at organizational level, but also at individual level as practitioners and people working within the built environment construction sectors. That's very much the call to action. Just really to conclude from my side, just a quick note, I guess, in terms of further resources. We were delighted as GHD to be part of this project. It's really at the core of our thinking as a business. And I'd really encourage you all to read the social impact paper, and all the details are on the slide. You can access through the links or through the QR code. The S in ESG is absolutely critical as we kind of transition the world towards a net zero future. It's going to mean a lot of change at an economic, social, behavioral level, all aspects of our life. And we believe this social impact paper provides an excellent kind of framework for us to be able to take forward a much more equitable transition as we go forward. So thank you very much. Look forward to the panel discussion. Go back to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Steve, for the introduction and for GHD's support and contribution in developing this paper. If I may ask one question before you go,
Sure.
How do you see this framework as useful for the sector, particularly from the GHD vantage point or of design perspective?
Big question, really. I think it's so important. I mean, we've seen through the scope emissions framework how industry has adopted that, and it's permeating through every aspect of the built environment life cycle. So I think we've seen the impact and the power of this sort of approach through the E, if you like. So building that out into the social frame, I think, is not only a very powerful way of doing it, because we're kind of using a methodology that people can relate to quite easily. But it also, it gives us a tool, gives us a mechanism to start bringing it into our everyday work. And it very much brings, I think, a lot of the transition discussion and activity back to a place-based sort of approach. We saw that very much through COP28, that the place-based equity transition, the growing agendas, very, very important agendas as we kind of accelerate the net zero future. So I think it gives a really good frame. From a personal perspective, what we're trying to do at GHD through Future Communities is really kind of place at the forefront of all our work a recognition that communities and places are the most successful and at their best when they're connected and they're resilient, inspired, and productive. And really underpinning that is putting people first. And so again, this framework really aligns with where we're thinking as a company and where we're going with our work across a whole range of different infrastructure sectors. And I think, I guess my reflection coming out of COP28 was we really need to move the dial quickly around net zero and transition. And we need to be able to, accelerate new approaches of, in terms of decision making and how we are judging projects and actions and activities. And for me, this is a huge addition to that kind of shift that we're going to have to make in the market. So again, I would just encourage everyone on the call to pick up the paper, point your phone at the QR code and download it, because it's a fascinating framework, really, really interesting report, and gives us a basis we can really start moving forward from as a sector. So yeah, very, very supportive and love it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Steve. And thank you very much for joining us again.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Next up, we will be going into the panel discussion. So please allow me to introduce you to our moderator, Nathalie Raoui. Nathalie is our regional coordinator for the MENA region. She is responsible for translating and implementing our global programs and efforts on a regional and local level. She assists in nurturing the network, building connections, and ensuring cultural attunement and resonance across our regional partners and green building councils. So on to you, Nathalie.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody here today. I'm so grateful to be part of this important discussion, and thank you as well to Alida and Scott for your inspiring and informative insights. We're going to dive in greater detail now into some of the elements included within this framework that represent a structure to consider the wide range of social challenges, as we've heard, that are felt across the full supply chain in the building and construction industry. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our esteemed speakers for this panel discussion. First off, we have Bianca, who is an Associate Sustainability Engineer and Social Impact Lead for Buro Happold. She's spearheading pertinent sustainability topics such as circular economics and health and well-being in the built environment. She works with industry and leadership, such as the UK GBC and the BRE, to inform the sustainability best practice and policy. Welcome, Bianca. Next up, we have Dan, who is a Senior Manager, Clean Construction and Just Transition at C40 Cities. He supports research and initiatives addressing the social impacts of decarbonizing the construction industry. He also manages a program called Cities Piloting a Just and Viable Transition to a Regenerative Built Environment, with the pilot cities being Oslo, Madrid, and London. Welcome, Dan. We also have Georgina, who is the Executive Director at GBC South Africa, heading up the technical team, where she focuses on collaborations and benchmarks that drive sustainable market transformation within the property sector. Georgina is passionate about green design, particularly when it is about delivering solutions that are practical, locally appropriate, and ambitiously driving change. And last but not least, we have Nadia, who is the Executive Director of the Global Initiative for Expo City Dubai. She has over 20 years of experience in the fields of policymaking, government affairs, and international relations. She began her career in policy roles in the European Commission and European Parliament, and now has been appointed to manage Expo Dubai Group, the global initiative of Expo City Dubai, dedicated to taking forward the legacy of World Expo 2020. Welcome, Nadia, and welcome to all of our speakers. And we are so grateful to have you as part of this panel discussing this important topic of social impact. Dan, I do not see you on. If you have your camera off. All right, perfect. Everybody's here. Amazing. All right, let's start this off. My first question is to you, Bianca. Why do you think corporations engage so much more with the E and the G than the S? And why do you see it as more useful or used to have the language specifically around the scopes for the S to mirror the E and the ESG?
Okay, so I think there are a few reasons at different scales that this is the case. I mean, first, the message around climate change and the multiplying threats of the 21st century is a lot more vivid. Environmental disaster is visible, whereas the human experience, except in the worst case scenarios, is largely internalized and the human condition is often invisible. So an appreciation and communication, and therefore an understanding for environmental sustainability in the built environment has been far more prominent, I think, in the last decade. This priority has manifested itself historically in sustainability frameworks, including those embedded in policy, which have also been much better at regulating and asking for the reporting on environmental sustainability, such as like BREEAM in the UK, for example, though it's worth noting that things are changing after working with the BRE, this is going to be much more carefully considered in the next version, for example. And then I think there's a question of measurement. Carbon, which is often the focus of the E, is an objectively easier thing to measure. It's also, I think, a question of agency and scope, and most importantly, data. As an industry, we often fall prey to losing interest after practical completion and move on to the next shiny thing. Where environmental sustainability is concerned, a lot of the considerations have to have already been made. And so this approach kind of lends itself to that in some ways, whereas in social sustainability, understanding people and the long-term resilience of not only their health and well-being, but also their interaction with the built environment is something that requires engagement, feedback loops, and a lifetime beyond practical completion. A lot can happen and should happen through design and construction, but after practical completion is where the good stuff happens in a way. And you see like a lot of livable cities like Vienna, for example, where the council retains ownership of a large proportion of housing, which allows for them to have continuous improvement and feedback loops, which is something that we should be looking to embed in the private sector. I suppose also while environmental sustainability is comfortable with getting, good outcomes with objective measures, a lot of best practice social impact involves both objective and subjective measures. And giving communities more autonomy and agency as well. And, objectivity is external to people, productivity, GDP, thermal comfort temperatures, urban heat island effect, flooding, number of trees and canopy coverage, density of windows on a street, population density, etc. And understanding which of these are important in different contexts to measure, to better understand the subjective good bits, like happiness, positive emotion, vitality, all that good stuff, can be more complicated, but is really important. And it also requires extra partnerships and engagements to the extent that is necessary for them to be done well and in a sustained manner. And that's arguably more outside the comfort zone of the industry. But we've made an incredible amount of progress in the last couple of years. And we need to continue to normalize this distinction in approach between the E and the S. But in terms of, the language around scopes, highlighting the scopes that we impact people at is really important, both for clients, designers, consultants, for them to think about and communicate the different ways that, projects impact people. In environmental sustainability, a feedback loop of calculations of how designs progress and affect client environmental ambitions is widely accepted. And the way that it has gained rigor over the years is through recognizing the different scopes. So I think that parallel is really important. I think it's also really important because, environmental and social sustainability are intrinsically linked. So considering them in tandem and with similar languages and scopes, I think is really important as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting topic to be discussing and to start to think about this language in a way that expands on both the subjective and objective aspects of social impact. And so my next question is to you, Georgina. Why is it so critical that we address all of these scopes, and how can we encourage organizations to start to focus on that and maybe think about why it's important to use this language as well?
Thanks, Natalie, and hi to everyone on the call from the tip of Africa in Cape Town. It's amazing to be on this panel. I think that the paper really has got some incredible things to say. And maybe in terms of answering the question, why is it important? It's worthwhile taking us back to the topic of the session. It's around, how do we action the S? So we all know social impact is important. It's a big part of kind of sustainability consultants' brief when they go out to understand how their building is going to impact on their community or on the neighborhood. But it's around getting that action in its scale. And the Green Building Council of South Africa, we're privileged to be part of, writing and contributing towards this paper with a lot of the GBCs that also contributed. And maybe just to share the journey around those 4 scopes and how they were developed and how they were conceived, to try and answer the question. Often for individuals, it can be tempting to think about social equity and kind of addressing those problems to be a problem out there. So outside of your organization, where other people live. And this can particularly be an issue in developing contexts or contexts that have got high levels of inequality. And obviously South Africa, would be one of those, definitely be one of those contexts. And often you would find that where you're thinking of implementing those solutions would be very different to, where you're actually living or working or kind of, spending the majority of your time. And the argument and the thinking at the time was that it's kind of sometimes this distance between us where the social inequity resides, and where some of the solutions are coming from that can create other distances too. And so the proposal was to, create interconnected modes of thinking about it so that you would invariably start off with where your organization is, regardless of the size. How are you implementing elements of social equity, and how are you looking at social impact in your organization, and then extend that to the 3, which, as Bianca and Steve, up to 3, which, the language is there, everybody's already familiar with it. But I think it's important, as a takeaway, that scope 0 is around bringing it home. So whether you're thinking about your own organization and there's an incredible flexible work from home policy that makes it possible for moms with small children to still have a full-time job, but they can actually handle it. Or, if you're actually looking at, building design issues, with some of the issues that Bianca has mentioned, where you're looking at either the daylighting or you're kind of looking at, fresh air, or if you're looking at a construction site and you've got workers on site, what are their labor rights? There's a central premise there that is around, having a workplace that is justified and dignified. But it's about making the value very real for all of us. And so that it's not about do as we say, but it's more around do as we do, or demonstrating that you can walk the talk associated with any of the solutions that you are implementing. And the thinking behind it was that would support many of us who are involved in this work and, who are very passionate about this work, because social impact is complex, right? There are lots of challenges. It's often easier, to deal with the environmental side of a building's performance benchmarks than looking at the social aspects. And I'll talk to that a little bit later from our experience. But really, it's about having that experience and actually being on the experiencing side of social equity and social impact, and how that then informs your ability to inform solutions further down the supply chain. Thanks.
Thank you, Georgina. And yes, for sure, it's do as we do, not as we say. And so I'm sure, Nadia, you have a lot to share about that from your experience at Expo. And how do you ensure that social impact is integrated and addressed across all of those 4 scopes? And maybe give some examples as to how you did that. Or are
Thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, to the World Green Building Council. Congratulations on the publication of this report. The size, the scale, the importance is critical, and I echo a lot of what the fellow panelists have spoken about, and I'd love to share and continue to learn from you all as we go through the next few minutes. So Expo City Dubai was born of hosting the World Expo in 2021 that we hosted after the pandemic. For those of you who don't know it, it's sort of a 4 square kilometer city that's a new city that's part of the extension of Dubai as part of Dubai Vision 2040. But of course, legacy first, that was the first department that we put in place as we were thinking about how do we build a new city that really espouses sort of a values-based approach in terms of, the leadership and how we want to really reshape the way we think about building, but also placemaking with humility, with respect, with integrity, with excellence, and born of that DNA of international cooperation. That is really effectively how we started. And so really sort of looking at 3 pillars of integration, impact, and how do we inspire? And I think what's really essential to start from is what we were sort of fundamentally focused on was how does the city espouse and integrate the Sustainable Development Goals entirely, and almost position sort of a new form of global international cooperation, regional cooperation, but also local. And so we did this through 4 key objectives, or we continue to do this through 4 key objectives, leaving a legacy of sustainable infrastructure, but also future-oriented sustainability practices, and then catalyzing those sustainability efforts in Dubai and across the UAE specifically, and increasing public awareness. I mean, we had 24.1 million visitors who came through our city in the first 6 months. And so really designing for public and designing for social impact always came first, really sort of creating those experiences and being very aware of that social environment and that social context very much from the outset. And then developing those sustainable solutions and scaling them. And that's something that I'll also speak about a little later that we continue to do as we thread through to today. But ensuring that sustainability in this holistic sense is really embedded in policy, taking the RISE guidelines, respect, impact, safety, environment, really focusing on, you know, what we've all spoken about so far, inclusivity, equity, sort of a healthy environment, really designing these operational guidelines as they apply to the region. So taking these global guidelines and looking at ways in which they can really thrive, but also how do we leverage the opportunity that we have to nurture them further and make them relevant to the context and the geography that we're in. And we did this through sort of really focusing on spreading best practice, championing new behaviors locally and regionally, and then providing that positive reputational advantage to stakeholders that we brought into the process. So what does it actually mean to you to then adopt all of these practices? And then designing that framework for sustainable supply chain practices, and therefore then really building a KPI and a lasting legacy, and specifically around business transformation. We had a very high target for SMEs and participation of the SME community. And that was really essential for us as we think, if we really think about the value of the legacy that we leave behind. And so really recognizing the pursuit of fairness in everything that we built and that we did, embedding inclusivity and accessibility in the entire life cycle of our project, not only from the design and the operation of the buildings, but also in our public realm, how we built for people of determination, those with sensory difficulties, women and children and families that were a huge stakeholder for us and a huge constituency for us. That sort of range from sort of our common external areas to our transport, to our live events, dedicated parking. I mean, these are sort of very specific examples, but POD way application, so how to navigate the site. What does that, I mean, a World Expo, if you've been to one, is a sensorial overload. What does that experience look like for every single person who comes through the doors? From sign language at events, quiet rooms for overstimulation or overwhelmed visitors, tactile paving, information boards. One of my most prized projects that we worked on also was publishing a children's book on tales from around the world in Braille. So really looking at the entire breadth of what was possible and then doing our very best to make sure that we did it. So we started it so it was easy then for others in the country, in the city, but perhaps also in the region to emulate. And then recruitment practices. We already have established our Emiratization policies and gender equity and gender equality. We reached above 50% women participation throughout the pre-event, but also during the event phase. Establishing health, safety, quality and environment. So this has been touched on by other colleagues on the question of blue-collar workers, but at a blue-collar worker level, really explaining what it means and implementing a system through the supply chain, through monthly meetings with contractors, mandated to ensure worker consultation on health, on safety, on worker welfare topics. I mean, even during 2 rounds of COVID, these initiatives were even more pressing. So sort of how do you train and systematize responses to strains on the supply chain and not forget the S in the ESG. And I think it was Bianca who alluded a little bit to balancing your time and your resources. I mean, what does it take to measure? How costly is it? And providing those feedback loops also that Bianca spoke about. How do you survive something like a pandemic together? Putting a COVID-19 task force in place, your vaccination campaign, your guides, your hotlines, keeping visitors safe. I mean, really creating that real value. I think also that Georgina spoke about do as we do. So really ensuring that we live and breathe the words that we're using, we're really putting them in place. And then ensuring engagement of a variety of stakeholder groups. And creating kind of new materiality assessments, both internal and external stakeholders, so our worker welfare, our supply chain, 192 countries, and now our tenants and our eventual residents who will be moving into the city at the end of next year. What does that all look like, and how does that manifest? A good example here perhaps is our schools program, where during our event we had 1 million students and teachers over 1,000 schools, and we continue to bring sort of the future generations into the conversation. So there's a whole breadth of activity, and I've only sort of touched on some of them, but really community engagement as a core principle. We spoke a little bit earlier, and other colleagues, about cities as narratives really being shaped by their inhabitants, and placemaking really being about integrating community stories into those urban spaces. And that for us is a priority.
Thank you so much, Nadia. And it was great. I was at Expo earlier this month, and it's really great to see all of this start to come to life. And cities really can be an opportunity and a vehicle for community, for storytelling, and for actually bringing social cohesion and the impact and really seeing those come to life. And so my next question is to you, Dan. Which elements of the social dimension do you see as the responsibility for cities to tackle versus others, like maybe Scope 0, that would obviously be a bit more private sector focused?
Thanks, Natalie, and it's great. Thanks for having me among these other speakers. Yeah, I think we've seen what happens when cities deliver climate action without equity and inclusion woven into policy design and practice. It can result, as we know, in sort of poor implementation. It can exacerbate existing inequalities. You have what some refer to as eco backlash, and this is rising a lot in many cities. And so I think some examples of where this happens is for private homeowners. They may not see a return, and many know they won't get a return on their investment to deeply retrofit their homes. So any city decision-making which puts pressure on them without the financial and or other incentives or supports isn't going to work. Likewise for tenants who can often be burdened by retrofit programs where landlords end up passing on the costs to those tenants. This makes climate policies from cities unpopular. Or workers in the building sector in particular, part of long chains of smaller companies without consistency necessarily in the skill sets or without direction on where the sector is heading, not to mention an aging workforce. This is something cities, of course, they play a central role in directing a just transition. And I wanted to say sort of, across the scopes, cities really are there to ensure social equity and the climate are not separate agendas as others have said, but they're one and the same. And that cities can really, I think, set up an enabling environment for the private sector, for workers, for communities to play their part in supporting climate mitigation and adaptation. So I wanted to mention the convening powers, in particular of cities, that they play that central role. A South African example here for Georgina, through our Inclusive Climate Action Program in Ekurhuleni, C40's work there as a part of the Global Green New Deal, and the funding that came to help South African cities get off of coal. Well, that presented a massive threat to jobs, and so this is where Ekurhuleni really stood out in establishing the first local just transition commission, and tailoring this commission to the needs of Ekurhuleni residents, workers, and businesses to help them through this transition. And I think it's, and then to tie this back to the built environment, I think it's interesting just to note that, you know, of the 600,000 climate mitigation jobs that were identified across 75 South African urban centers, nearly half of these were identified in the deep retrofit of buildings. So representing a massive space for addressing climate and creating green jobs. And that's something we really speak a lot about at C40, and something that cities can really latch onto quite easily when it comes to job creation, which also works well when engaging unions and showing how the transition can create new jobs, as opposed to a narrative which might be more about the potential losses. And maybe I'll just make 2 points specifically to scopes 1 and 2 of the social impact paper. At the building user and site level, cities, not only through planning laws, of course, to increase densities for housing delivery, to maximize use of land. They, you know, the methods that they have in place to potentially keep people within a neighborhood to avoid displacement can result in more retrofit of buildings, so making the best use of what exists. But then at the same time, the cities have to marry this with policies around rent control to ensure that the costs of retrofit or densification doesn't actually become burdensome in a financial sense. And then on scope 2, if we broaden it out, I really believe and have seen examples of where cities, as land property owners, and some cities own more land and manage more land than others, but where they do, often there's pressures to sell that land, and I would suggest that actually they're better off for longer term value if they actually lend those or lease those to community-led organizations who know best on how to deliver the right type of housing that's needed, who can manage and maintain that housing and that land in the long term, which ultimately can bring an uplift in value and economic returns for cities. So there's almost a business case there for cities to maintain some stake in what they own, but for the social benefit that can be reaped from doing that by working directly with existing community groups locally.
Thank you. Yeah, that's some great insight there. And I'm just wondering now, now that we've heard all these things, Bianca, just a few thoughts from a designers and engineers perspective. Why do you think this is so important, and how do we start to build that into the construction life cycle? But just a short and sweet response if possible.
I'll try my best. So I guess, you know, we've touched on, you know, how many groups of people we impact through design, construction, and operation. And in a lot of ways, the reason it's so important is for the same reason that it's important to support environmental sustainability at all the stages of design and construction. You know, choices are made which have massive effects on supply chains, occupants, communities, and all choices that we make have consequences. Monitoring, measuring, creating accountability through them is essential to achieving, you know, project goals and the long-term resilience of projects. In design, we have the opportunity to understand the baseline, increase participation, figure out the best way for a project to fill the gaps for local needs, which is all crucial to understand how things will manifest in operation. In construction, you have the power to decide, you know, where the money goes. Your interactions with the supply chain are at its highest, and you can mitigate slave labor through proper specification of material purchasing, or decide to use a local MSME, for example. You know, buildings and places have embodied social impact in the same way that they have embodied carbon. And both design and construction involve choices that lead us down paths of no return. In operation, which, as I mentioned before, is where the cool stuff happens. We have an opportunity to provide ownership and agency to guardians of strategies, and, you know, implement those feedback loops of continuous improvement as the built environment actually reacts to the hypotheticals that, you know, we put in place as designers and engineers. You know, how humans will interact with our design is not 100% predictable, so having the feedback loops can ensure the long-term vitality and resilience of a project. And, you know, after PC, we also have the opportunity to measure the subjective bits instead of relying on the objective measures in operation. So yeah, I think I won't go any further. I know we're a bit behind on time.
Thank you so much. And I like that idea of embodied social impact and really starting to integrate this language is similar to the E as well. And Georgina, just if you can share maybe a few examples of some of the projects or how these have panned out in your work in South Africa.
Yep, I'll keep it quick. So I mean, obviously South Africa's got a lot of social equity issues. Our Gini coefficient sitting at 0.8. One's obviously the worst. And I think like 1% of the population contributes to 42% of all of our wealth. I'm thinking of some of the latest reports. So, it's been a social mandate through all government programs and policies and various initiatives. So, for example, like the C40 kind of support programs that Dan was mentioning have been amazing, particularly from a sustainability and a greening perspective, to support our public sector address a lot of these issues. And then the private sector comes in, with various kind of programs and initiatives. From a GBCSA's perspective, and from the GBCSA's perspective and a Green Building Council, our role is obviously to really promote green buildings and the value of green buildings, and how that translates into social value, social impact. We all know that green design should be informed by good design and sensible design, and that typically will translate into a better quality building. And that speaks to things like better thermal comfort. So when kids are doing their homework at home, it's in an comfortable temperature. There's no massive overheating, because we don't have a lot of air conditioning in our housing in South Africa. So there are a lot of elements like that where we try and promote the resilience benefits of green buildings. In terms of kind of specific projects, we had quite an interesting one. It was in 2014, and Bianca mentioned, the complexity of social impact indicators. We actually developed a social economic tool. It was kind of like an add-on to our existing Green Star tool. It's to add to your acronym soup, the SEC tool, socio-economic tool. And it was great. It looked at things like employment creation, enterprise development, skills development, health and safety, community benefits. Government was involved. And wonderful criteria, very detailed, looking at a lot of our kind of social equity issues and building on existing legislation. But the truth is we had very little take-up of that, from the private sector and from a voluntary basis. And I don't think that's because people are not interested or, the heart isn't there. I think it's around making sure that when we're implementing these criteria at a building level and making them very tangible for engineers, for designers, for clients, for project managers, for QSs, for contractors, the criteria need to be thought through quite differently, and we can't necessarily apply the same lens that we've used in our traditional green building kind of way of looking at it. And so we're busy with a big update right now, and we're totally reinventing the wheel, but we're taking a lot of those lessons learned, and the big takeaway is to go for progress over perfection, and to kind of rather have smaller nuanced steps that transform the market, not necessarily incrementally, but at least develop, buy-in and the ability to progress over time. So happy to share that with everybody once we're complete. And if you ever want to have a look at the criteria that we did develop, we can share it on this platform as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I know we're running a bit over time, but there's just so much to share, and I'm sure you all have a lot more to share. So everybody, please feel free to reach out to the speakers to learn more about what they're doing and how they're integrating social impact into the work. And just before we move on, I'd like each of you to just give a quick 10-second answer as to how you think what's the takeaway message that you think people can chew on or think about in terms of social impact and how to start to integrate it into their work. And I'll start with Nadia.
Thank you so much. There was a question in the chat as well. I'm going to try and answer that really fast as well. I think it's important to remember here why we were born, and the impact that a major event can have on urban planning. So yes, we are a political project, but it's our responsibility to catalyze change. And so as we think about everything that we did in terms of impact on urban planning, sustainable and resilient urban development, you know, and is urging urban populations in the world, particularly in the Imerse region, how can we take the lessons learned, continue to learn, continue to apply them in the social sphere, such as what I talked about earlier, the emphasis on local procurement, and the emphasis on basic human needs. We have done a study of many different frameworks that exist, but then we've created our own, and we've realized that we are greater than the sum of our parts. So we have consolidated all of this in our own resilience journey. And so our call to action, therefore, is awareness. Find out what it means, not only to set up shop with us and be part of our journey, but really to partner. And I do urge everybody to reach out directly through this platform or to me directly. Agency, we are building our tools for partnership to really fulfill our mandate as a Centre for Planetary Solutions. I didn't get a chance to talk about that, but I'm very keen to build that out further with you individually, and help us to build this ecosystem so that together we are greater than the sum of our parts.
Yes, I love that. Collaboration is really the key to taking these initiatives forward. And so, Dan, if you have any comments on how to take this into cities and how to build that out, just a few words before we finish off here.
Yeah, I'll just say that for cities, we have to remember that they have a mandate, you know, to make social changes that might come out of tragic events or movements. They have to make these a political priority. And we need these leaders to demonstrate that these agendas are not only carried by those minorities, you know, not only by women, not only by people of different genders, non-genders, but are citywide agendas for the cities to take on as their mandate. And I guess my call to the sector would be to see your mayor and city officials as allies in shifting the market. They have convening powers, are willing to innovate if equipped with enough evidence, best practice, and shown the co-benefits of tackling the whole life carbon of buildings. And I think together, only together, industry and cities, are we going to create an engaging narrative to make embodied carbon something that matters to everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, for sure. And my apologies, everyone. I know that there's a lot more to share and there's a lot to say. Bianca, Georgina, if you just have a couple of words, 10 seconds each, just as a take-home message before we close off this panel.
Sure. Okay, if I had to say it in one sentence, I guess I'd say that it's really important that we think about environmental sustainability with the social sustainability, and that they're intrinsically linked. Environmental justice is intrinsic, and it's both our environment and livelihoods that are at risk, and those two things are not separated, and it's really important to consider them in tandem. And so to normalize that, and to normalize the subjectivity as well as the objectivity post-completion in the built environment, I think is really important. Yeah.
I would say, in the alleged words of Winston Churchill, we shape our buildings, and then I think and thereafter they shape us. So I would just think of that quote when I'm making any decision on a project. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, that's some great insight from all. And I'll hand it back over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, all. We'll just go over by 5 minutes so we can hear from our closing remarks speaker. But thank you very much, Bianca, Dan, Georgina, and Nadia, for the fantastic insights into the work that you do on social impact. And to nicely wrap it up, I'd like to introduce you to our closing remarks speaker, Maria Fernanda Cachafeiro. Maria is Head of Sustainability at Multiplex, with over 10 years experience driving sustainability within the built environment in the UK and abroad. And in her current role, Maria is responsible for all aspects of environmental and social sustainability, including delivery of the 2030 strategies for Multiplex. So please go ahead, Maria.
Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. First of all, I would like to reflect on the conversation from Bianca, Nadia, Dan, and Georgina. For Multiplex, our scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions is something that most people understand in a way. Whilst it may be only the sustainability team who knows the data in detail, most people are able to identify what falls where. As Bianca mentioned, the mirroring of the language for the scopes in the social value guide is really helpful. This is an opportunity for us to review how we communicate the more subjective measures for social considerations, aligning with these scopes and further showcasing the links between the E and the S. Linked to what Dan was saying about cities and policies, I would like to mention the example from the UK of the planning conditions under Section 106. A Section 106 is an agreement between a developer and a local planning authority about measures that the developer must take to reduce their impact on the community. These may include requirements for local procurement, local employment, etc., which certainly enforce some of those outcomes that would be voluntary, but certainly are best practice and for all of us to implement regardless. Thank you all again for the fantastic conversation and sharing all your knowledge on this topic. And now to tell you a bit about Multiplex and what we do. For those of you who don't know Multiplex, we are a global contractor and we have a long history of ESG. But before I highlight our social impact work, I would like to say that we genuinely care about people. We respect, include, and look not only after our people, but also those around us, empowering them and supporting them to thrive. The construction industry is one of the largest sectors within the UK, employing over 8% of the overall UK workforce. As a contractor, the opportunities that we have to make real change on people's lives motivates our entire business. In 2021, we launched Leave No One Behind, and it was great to hear Alida during the opening remarks referring to the just and equitable transition with these exact same words. Leave No One Behind is our 10-year social equity strategy to tackle inequality and injustice in construction. But following our social equity strategy, in 2022, we launched our ESG supply chain charter. We know that success will come through actions, not through words, and we can't do this alone. Our ESG supply chain charter summarizes those actions where we want to work collaboratively with our supply chain to ensure we are on track to deliver on our ambitions. We must work together to construct a better future. Our legacy is present in every local community we operate in and the supply chain we work with, through local employment, creating pathways to employment via work placements, designing innovative educational programs that inspire and challenge students, volunteering and supporting local good causes and initiatives. We have focused today on the S of ESG, but as Georgina mentioned, we now have to remember to look at all of these scopes of social impact because they are all interconnected. And I would like to give you a few examples of what we are doing, which very much build on the examples that Nadia mentioned for Expo City Dubai. And hopefully these are food for thought for your own actions. For Scope 0, entity and internal practices, similar to an ISO 14001 environmental management system, we have an ethical labor management system, which formalizes the improvements that we are making to our working practices to tackle labor exploitation and increase worker welfare. Scope 1, building users on site. When you think of construction sites, the first image that comes to your mind may be a temporary dusty site cabin. We have challenged that approach and launched better workspaces, our own building standard that is inspiring the WELL building standard, and it focuses on the well-being of the individuals used in our offices and our temporary facilities. Scope 2, community and surroundings. No one likes having a construction site on the other side of the road, but minimizing our impacts as a construction company and building on our legacy by becoming an active member of the community and by being transparent, facilitating opportunities, and building a legacy certainly changes that perception. Finally, for Scope 3, supply and value change, very much linked to transparency and auditing and labor rights, we have engaged with a third party who completes site engagement audits across all of our sites. What they do is go for a site walk and start a conversation with the workers, asking them how they got recruited for their jobs, they understand their pay slips or any deductions in there. And based on those findings, we work collaboratively with our supply chain to review their practices so that we can all make sure that the people who are working on Multiplex sites are treated fairly. And finally, my call to action is to move forward with a renewed approach to decarbonization with social equity at the core. What I mean with this is our commitment to continual learning, where we all prioritize educating ourselves and our supply chains through workshops, training sessions, and frequent assessments of our working practices. I think it is also important to encourage industry transparency and sharing data on best practice, but also on those lessons learned from initiatives that may not have gone so well, but let's save others from making the same mistakes we did. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, and for the great call to action. Thank you for joining us. So I'd like to thank all our speakers and audience for joining us today, and hope you found it as valuable as I did, and learning, leaving you with new thoughts and perspectives of creating positive social impact in your work and around us. So thank you once again for being a part of this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Have a wonderful day. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone. Cheers.